Night leans gently over Delhi, and in the palace archives, the air moves slowly enough to make the ceiling fan seem like a polite suggestion rather than a machine. A single lamp pulls its light across a desk decked with scrolls, letters, and brittle pages that look as though they have been waiting for centuries to be touched again. Some carry margins filled with hesitant ink and order revised mid-sentence, a decree scratched out just before the wax could set. Others bear dates that never made it into the chronicles, letters from royal women whose voices slipped through the curtains of the Zenana, builders' sketches marked with numbers that seem to solve one riddle while writing another. Outside, the city folds itself into night sounds, a faraway cartwheel on stone, the cry of a fruit bat, the river moving somewhere beyond the walls. But here, in the quiet center of the Empire's memory, each page opens like a door no one locked properly. Some lead to emperors who vanish behind their own commands. Some reveal palaces abandoned as if they decided mid-reign to forget their rulers. Others trace the fate of jewels whose journeys end in unexpected places, Parisian vaults, Persian courts, private collections where history is a matter of rumor rather than record. And if this journey keeps you company tonight, you can stay as long as you like. The stories will wait, turning their own pages, whether your eyes close now or much later. So let us follow the lamplight deeper into the palace corridors, where the air smells faintly of ink and marble dust, and the shelves lean with the weight of centuries. We will move carefully as the clerks once did, past sealed letters that outlived the hands which signed them, past builders' diagrams that hum softly with geometry and ambition, past chronicles where the ink falters just enough to let a secret breathe through. Each turn in the corridor holds another fragment, an emperor's order that never reached its destination, a princess's diary line interrupted mid-thought, a map curling at the edges as if trying to hide the river it once revealed. We have things to unwrap that move at the speed of dust, which is to say, perfectly for bedtime. The first clues rustle from paper that wasn't meant to survive. Orders written in a grand hand taper off, as if a brush paused to listen to a fly. Margins host tiny notes in a different ink and aid, an aide who couldn't help himself, perhaps, or a prying nephew with access to good pens. The imperial seal appears in 2 sizes, which is not dramatic unless you are a scribe. There are faint pinpricks along one edge of a decree where a thread once held a smaller slip, a rider to an order, or an afterthought stapled with string. The sensation is delightfully anticlimactic. The Empire's decisions were not thunderbolts. They were paperwork, and sometimes the paperwork wandered off. When the Emperor's voice vanishes mid-sentence, a clerk steps in to finish, copying the style but forgetting to underline a title. It is like listening to a friend imitate a parent on the phone. Convincing if you aren't listening too closely, wonderfully obvious if you are. In a pile of letters that were catalogued as miscellaneous domestic, we hear the quiet of the women's world, not drama from behind the Purda screens, but schedules, recipes, trade notes about saffron quality, and a polite reminder that the peacocks are eating the young cucumber shoots again. A princess writes that her lamp smokes unless the wick is braided with 3 threads. It's a precise complaint and also a soft microhook, because suddenly we can smell the lamp and see her ink drying by the window. She notes what she's paid. The orchard keeper complains that dates promised for Wednesday arrived on Thursday, proof that even. Within a palace, delivery delays are a timeless human experience, and copies a line of poetry that is a little too sharp to be harmless. The Emperor's vanishings, as it turns out, are ordinary. He delegates, he hesitates, and sometimes his orders are rewritten by cousins who knew where to find the blotting sand. Power is less a lion's roar than a murmur that changes pitch from room to room. In that hum, we find signatures that migrate by a few millimeters between lines, as if the signatory's elbow rested on a cushion that deflated while he wrote. A seal shows a tiny chip, which helps date a series of commands because the chip appears, then does not, then returns like a mole on a cheek that artists disagree about. A clerk revises a date by scraping the surface with a sliver of shell, and writing again on the thinning paper that now glows when held to light, a delicate halo around a scheduling change. Marriages, too, are scheduled changes. So many letters discuss alliances in the tone of a household shopping list. Fluency in this slow language is sleep-friendly. It's all about the margin. A wedding shifted to avoid the bad date, a dowry chest weighed with a note that 2 of the hinges creak, and a cousin who asks for a copy of the astrological chart because his version has tea spilled on the house of Venus. None of this resolves anything. It lulls. A scribe complains that the man bringing sand for the ink doesn't shake the bag first, so the fine grains clump. A princess requests cinnamon that does not smell like the clay jar it came in. It's all deeply important to someone and mildly amusing to us at midnight, and the empire keeps running on these small corrections like a vast machine that occasionally needs a nudge on the left wheel. We drift from paper to stone because sleep likes textures. At night, the Taj Mahal hums in a different register. Laser scans very polite ones, touch the marble in a pattern, and send back numbers that look like lullabies for engineers. Under that numeric net appeared dots that line up at perfect human heights, scaffold sockets for planks that went up and came down, a faint punctuation of construction that you don't notice in sunlight. The stones whisper their geometry. There's a place where sound returns to you softly if you speak toward the wall, an acoustic pocket that builders probably use to listen to their work happen, like tapping a fruit to see if it's ripe. In a parapet, tiny marks show where a mason aligned his compass. They are the yawns of a compass, barely opened. If you follow the marble inlay vines, you find a flower with one petal slightly out of rotation, evidence of a craftsman who reseated a piece after the gum set. It's not a flaw, it's a heartbeat. The pale translations of those data sets say little that would embarrass a tour guide. Mostly, they confirm that the building was assembled with a calm obsession for repetition. The real secret is not a hidden room. It's that the same curve appears again, and again, only one grain off, like a lullaby sung by someone walking a baby in circles. The rhythm changes when we walk Fatehpur Sikri's dry courtyards. Here water used to move with theater, channels bringing a cool line down through courtyards, shallow tanks where stars floated at night, a sound like a copper cup being set gently on stone. Now the channels are quiet, but salts remember flow the way rings remember seasons. White film crystals bloom in a map of where water wanted to be. People say the city was abandoned for want of water, but the more boring truth is soporific. It was a collection of tiny miscalculations adding up over years. Drainage that clogged, a diverted stream that didn't return, a well that silted up around a jar lowered once too often without rinsing. The empire's traveling court, which could pack up like a patient caravan, did just that, not because of a curse, but because the spreadsheets, if palm leaf lists can be called that, kept advising a move. Imagine courtiers debating the angle of a channel while the custard cooled too fast in the kitchens. They did, and then they traveled. On the way out, someone locked a small gate and forgot the key, which today means you can see through its lattice and watch a lizard sun itself on a step that was supposed to be shaded by water. This is the kind of mystery that solves itself by taking a nap. Jewels nap in darkness, and their dreams are inventory lists. The peacock throne, whose name encourages a certain mood of drama, left behind the least dramatic trail possible, numbers. We find it in phrases like seat with birds and object with stones of weight such and such, written by treasurers who are allergic to adjectives. After invasions and relocations, parts of the throne reappear as brooch and sword hilts, like a cake that was cut up and passed around a very large party, where not everyone saved their plates. No one ever writes, "We melted history today." They write, "Received, 4 rubies, recut, weight revised," which is the same thing in the key of accounting. The style of peacock feathers copied in lacquer boxes a century later suggests that the throne as afterlife was more brochures than bird, more memory than furniture. The throne survived as instructions for painting it on things that had no business being thrones, which is a bit like keeping a city alive by chiseling its skyline into soap. And then there is the diamond whose name means mountain of light, a term so confident that it almost snores. The early life of that stone is a long hallway lined with labels that keep falling off. In one court it is a talisman, in another it is a bargaining chip. The cutting changes its personality, a flatter face here, a deeper pavilion there, as if the gem tried on hats to see which made it look most imperial. Even microscopic scratches can say that the stone sat beside another in a crowded setting long enough to whisper. Later histories tidy things. Earlier notes are messier, big bright stone, perhaps the same as a phrase that is both sleep-inducing and, to scholars, oddly thrilling. It is the scholarly version of finding a familiar spoon in a drawer far from the kitchen. The diamond's reputation swells or shrinks depending on the wearer's PR strategy. Some rulers did not enjoy being overshadowed by a rock. If a precise origin eludes us, that's fine. Origins are loud answers. Bedtime likes gentle maybes. The gem, for its part, kept being a gem. Like a nightlight, it did its job while people argued about fixtures. And then there's the diamond whose name means mountain of light, a term so confident that it almost snores. The early life of that stone is a long hallway lined with labels that keep falling off. In one court, it is a talisman. In another is a bargaining chip. The cutting changes its personality, a flatter face here, a deeper pavilion there, as if the gem tried on hats to see which made it look most imperial. Even microscopic scratches can say that the stone sat beside another in a crowded setting long enough to whisper. Later histories tidy things. Earlier notes are messier, big bright stone, perhaps the same as a phrase that is both sleep-inducing and, to scholars, oddly thrilling. It is the scholarly version of finding a familiar spoon in a drawer far from the kitchen. The diamond's reputation swells or shrinks depending on the wearer's PR strategy. Some rulers did not enjoy being overshadowed by a rock. If a precise origin eludes us, that's fine. Origins are loud answers. Bedtime likes gentle maybes. The gem, for its part, kept being a gem. Like a nightlight, it did its job while people argued about fixtures. We lay down the jewels and return to bodies, which is somehow calmer than it sounds. Royal physicians wrote case notes with the bedside manner of bookkeepers. They described diets that sound like the world's slowest tasting menu, then pulses counted to the beat of a finger. Herbs appear with the certainty of relatives at festivals, each with a role: cooling, drying, balancing. A few notes are so precise they read cozy. A ruler's sleep is better when the mattress is aired for 2 hours in winter sun. The musk should be kept in a pouch away from the sickroom linens. The water given between medicines should be hand cool, which is as gentle a temperature as you can hope for in any century. The causes of death are not cinematic. They are chains of plotting decisions, too much or too little rest, a season of damp, a weakened appetite soothed with sweet rice on 4 consecutive evenings. If the doctors mention stars, they do so in a sensible way, noting that a journey should be delayed not because Mars is angry, but because the road is muddy, and the patient refuses to ride in a curtained cart, which makes drafts inevitable. Even grief is measured. The protocol for the final bath is written with the same neat margins as a recipe. From margins, we learn how a palace grieves. Quietly with towels warmed near coals, with a list of things to send to the shrine in the morning, with a reminder to dispatch a rider to a cousin who loved the late emperor's jokes. The notes repeat phrases until they turn into lullabies. Bodies lead us to gardens because Mughal rulers preferred to rest near water and pathways that folded earth into rectangles so pleasing that even maps look drowsy. Babur's garden plans read like a person sketching ideas on a long train ride. pointing out slopes and pleasant breezes with a pencil that keeps dulling. He loved to place a watercourse where the sun could warm it by noon, then cool it by shade at 3, as if guests might sit near it and decide they had time to be thoughtful. Some of those gardens faded under silt. Others were repurposed, which is an elegant way to say someone built a grain market right through the middle. New surveys dryly reveal faint lines previously water, now ghost paths etched in soil chemistry, and the way grass refuses to grow in right angles after 4 centuries. From above, the maps look like cross-stitch someone forgot to finish, and if that image makes you yawn, congratulations, you're joining a long tradition of administrators who drifted during irrigation briefings. The gardens teach us a practical lesson masquerading as poetry. If you lay out the world as a grid of shade and running water, people will find ways to sit where the two overlap. They will shell almonds and make plans that involve very small boats. They will also, inevitably, store things where the air is coolest and then forget where the keys went. The Empire's river maps dotted with gardens are less about rule than routine, how to move an afternoon gently from one pavilion to another with only the sound of water to mark the time. We circle back, as gardens do, to paper. Letters return to their pigeonholes. Seals return to their velvet beds. A princess's note about the lamp wick becomes a record of domestic technology, which is a lofty way to say that people then, like us now, like the room to smell right before sleep. A draft order bearing 2 handwritings becomes a lesson in teamwork that no one asked for. A decree with a stitched-on amendment is just a reminder that nobody gets the words right the first time. Marble breathes a little. Salts crystallize with night air. A caretaker taps the floor with the end of a broom and recognizes the hollow sound where a pipe runs. In the treasury, a clerk writes "balanced," which is handsome to read beside midnight. The famous throne remains missing in the comfortable sense, diffused into 1,000 small, traceable somethings. The famous diamond remains present in the comfortable sense, doing its job of catching light while history decides which adjective to stick on it next. If you prefer an empire to be a puzzle with a triumphant final piece, you may be disappointed. The Mughal mysteries that were just solved mostly turn out to be the kind of solutions archivists celebrate with a cup of tea. This word means fold, not fort. This line belongs to Tuesday's bundle. This watermark dates a sheet to a mill near the river where geese were known to wander, which explains the feather stuck to the pace. The older we let these answers be, the softer they sound. The structural tricks of a white mausoleum turn out to be repetitions of circles and squares, tidy and patient. The abandoned capital's secret is that everything is easier with reliable water. The throne's afterlife is dispersed glamour. The diamond's beginning is an honest maybe. The physician's notes are recipes for care. The gardens are diagrams for breathing outdoors. A final micro-hook whispered as the fan ticks. Somewhere in an archive box, a napkin-sized scrap records that the emperor was pleased by the taste of melon on a particular morning when a breeze from the river reached the courtyard before prayer. The scribe wrote the melon note between 2 lines about laborers' wages, as if the empire could not help including the smallest pleasures alongside the largest responsibilities. That's not a twist, it's a rhythm. Detail, expansion, soft humor, fade, repeat. If you're still awake, you may place a very gentle bookmark here. If you've drifted, the marble will keep whispering circles to itself, and the paper will go on being thin at the places where the ink changed its mind. You might not expect an empire to whisper, but Mughal India does. It whispers from the fold of a decree where a clerk pressed too hard and left a ridge, from the smudge where a seal met damp sand and slid a little, from the polite ink of a princess who reminded the steward that coriander should be bought before the heat. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe, or you can simply think the word subscribe and let it drift into the air like incense. Either way, nothing urgent will happen. We are going to walk through quiet rooms, read other people's grocery lists, and listen for geometry in stone. Imagine the sound of a long corridor where sandals move without hurry, and the pages of a register make that soft wing-beat sound as someone turns them with just enough care not to lick a finger. The Emperor's orders live in files, but not always in his hand. Sometimes he begins a sentence and someone else ends it. The brush changes in mid-stroke, the way a river alters color where two currents meet. A date that once read Thursday now reads Thursday but later, because a clerk scraped the paper with a shard of shell and wrote again in smaller letters to fit the space. Marginalia arrives like careful coughs. Verify salt delivery. Replace lamp oil smoky. Send copy to cousin's office. Prior copy misplaced during monsoon. It is Empire by errand. A little miracle hides in the signatures. The imperial seal appears with a tiny chip after a certain month, and that chip travels with it like a companion. Once you see the chip, you can date a bundle of papers to the season when the seal fell from a desk onto tile, when the steward's apprentice said, "Shall I have the stone reset?" And someone murmured, "Later," meaning never. Power looks like certainty from far away. Up close, it looks like a blotter kept too near the T. Behind the screens where women lived, letters are not dramatic. They are domestic instruments tuned with care. A princess writes about cardamom prices with the gravity of a treaty and slips, at the end, a line of poetry that says more than it should. She records a fasting schedule, then notes that the embroidery needles must be sharpened in the courtyard, not indoors, because the filings call mice from the kitchen. Another reminds her brother that the new silk canopies fade on the windward side. Rotate them every third week, she says, like a gardener turning a pot. We can mistake these for chores. But they are little levers for moving a world. From the Purda rooms, alliances bloom like pomegranate flowers on a hot wall. A detailed list, who sat where at a feast, who asked for more sweet lime, quietly diagrams a bargain. The handwriting is neat enough to put you to sleep, but the sentences bend like reeds with the river's current behind them. Somewhere between the lists appears an aside. The Emperor's wrist pained him after writing. He favored the left. It is the sort of thing families notice and governments forget, until the government needs the family to remind it which hand to set the ink near. The letters settle themselves back into their boxes, and we step into marble. At night, the Taj Mahal is all breath and measure. When people use light to read stone, the stone reads them back. There are tiny sockets where scaffolds once rested, round as fingertips. There are guiding scratches under the inlay vines, thin as eyelash lines, the geometry a mason used, and then covered, like the pencil outline, under a painting. If you stand in a certain balcony and try a word, any word, melon works nicely. The sound returns with a polite bow, a reminder that the builders understood how voices behave around curved surfaces. The famous optical tricks are soothingly practical up close. The calligraphy is larger at the top, so it looks the same size from the ground. That is all. No secret society needed, only eyes and care. A petal of red stone is turned a fraction off its neighbors, and your mind supplies the rest, content. The great mystery, solved by lasers and patient people in soft-soled shoes, is that a miracle can be measured with very small rulers. This does not reduce the miracle. It moves the wonder from rumor to routine, and there is something even more sleep-friendly about a miracle that clocks in and out like a careful worker. We leave the river mist and walk the dry courtyards of Fetafa Sikri, a capital with the pleasant habit of explaining itself once you ask nicely. White veils of salt bloom on sun-warmed stone, drawing the ghost lines of lost channels. A trickle once ran here to cool this step, then carried onto that pool where stars floated at night like fruit seeds. Drainage, too shallow. Well, too far, a canal, a degree off. Each small miscalculation is a yawn, And the sum of yawns is a nap from which the city did not wake. People like to say the capital died of thirst, as if that were poetic justice for some unspecified imperial excess. The paperwork says otherwise. It says there were lists and plans and a lot of measuring, and then there were more lists, and then somebody quietly moved the court back to the river. The most dramatic object left behind is a key that fits nothing. It hangs on a hook in a guard room where, during evening rounds, a watchman taps each door with his stick, including the one that no longer opens. You can hear the tap, 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 and the long pause afterward, the thoughtful silence of a person who has concluded that some problems have chosen their own endings. Treasure prefers to be dull when it is doing its job. The peacock throne survives chiefly as arithmetic. Seat with birds, one treasurer wrote, and then he wrote weights, and then smaller numbers after cutting, the way tailors bring garments in and sigh it seems. After invasion, jewels wander. Some reappear in inventories of distant rooms, wearing new names, like students who reinvent themselves at universities. Lacquer boxes painted long after the throne dissolved into elsewhere still offer peacocks with tails arranged in a particular way. Style travels even when stones do not. That is the throne's afterlife. Repetition with variation, like a lullaby sung in many houses that all borrowed the same melody from a neighbor. No clerk writes sorrowfully melted. They write assorted gems for mounts too. Adjustments in account. You can almost hear the scratch of the pen and the contented exhale of a person balancing a column. The mountain of light diamond is less a mountain than a long, slow hill. Its early history is an honest compost heap of perhapses. It lived here or there. It is cut like this or not yet. Under magnification, tiny scrapes suggest it once sat side by side with another stone, and they talked all day, the small talk of friction. When a ruler needed to look stern, the diamond learned to be modest. When a ruler needed to look irresistible to daylight, the diamond was willing to cooperate by catching every sun the window allowed. Later commentators, hungry for clarity, serve conclusions like well-cut mango. Earlier sources are agreeable to insomniacs. They say things like large bright stone, reportedly the same, and then digress into the excellent diet served at court that spring. The best fact of all is that a jewel can be famous while its past remains a friendly blur. People slept under domes without knowing whether the moonlight on the floor had visited that stone first or its cousin. Sleep and fame shared a room and got along surprisingly well. We set the jewels down and pick up a doctor's notebook. Physicians of the court wrote in a tone designed never to alarm anyone. A ruler's fever is warmth. A fainting episode is emptiness, best treated with a mild syrup and a window set ajar to the north. The notes are curiously tactile. Pulse better at wrist than at ankle today. Breath evenly scented. Keep the musk away from bed. Linens. You begin to suspect that good medicine, then as now, was chiefly the art of paying attention without fidgeting. Causes of death, when they come, are not thunderclaps. They are slow mathematics, a low appetite multiplied by damp weeks, divided by too many meetings in a room with poor cross-ventilation, added to an elder's insistence on sleeping without a shawl because he did not want to be mistaken for someone needing help. The doctors write recipes that could double as lullabies. Barley water, hand cool, pomegranate broth strained through clean cloth. When grief enters, it does so like a clerk. There are seps. The last bath is warm. The towels are warm too. The final prayers are said with the economy of people who know that repetition is the parent of comfort. A writer carries the news to a cousin who already suspects he is needed because last week's note mentioned the afternoon nap had become longer than usual. Even grief points toward gardens because the Mughals believed water and order calmed the soul whether the soul was still breathing or had found other appointments. Babur wrote garden dreams with a pencil that enjoyed wandering. He liked terraces that moved water like an argument settled in segments. A square of shade, then a channel, then a platform for to arrange these, and people will naturally decide to be gentle. Later gardeners misread his notes or pretended to for the sake of convenience, placing water where it preferred not to go, and the water soaked into the soil. Today, satellite eyes notice faint rectangles under fields, as if patterns fell asleep and left their impressions on the sheets. You can walk along the street and sense, not see, that a wall used to guide a breeze. In certain courtyards, dust avoids the center as if a pool still owns the rights to that rectangle. Administrators use the maps to plan drains. Poets use them to plan naps. Both are right. If you sit where a watercourse once flowed and open a fig, the tiny sounds of the seeds snapping under your teeth will match the pace of historic irrigation, which is either coincidence or the universe being considerate. The palace archive returns, cheerful as a kitchen at the back of a restaurant. Worn cords tie bundles of paper. A label reads, "Misc Small Matters," which is a description of most human experience. One note, folded twice, records that melon at breakfast was pleasing because the breeze arrived earlier than usual from the river. The scribe wrote this between wages for brick carriers and a reminder to replace a shutter hinge. The sentences do not argue about their relative importance. They hold hands and walk down the page together. Another slip records that a parrot in the women's quarters began to say the name of a city the court had left behind. The steward diplomatically suggests the bird be taught a newer name. If the emperor laughed, the paper does not tell us. The court moves again, and in the moving, it sheds and gathers according to the arithmetic of carts and patience. Someone misplaces a recipe for pickled limes and later claims the kitchen deliberately hid it to maintain status. The kitchen points to the shelves and says nothing. That is also policy. We return to marble one more time because repetition has the courtesy of being restful. The stones of Agra are as exact as always, and also full of kindness. On a stair, a mason built an imperceptibly lower riser, where he knew elderly courtiers paused to turn toward the river view. It is a tiny concession, a stone version of pulling up a chair. In a corner, the Imlay work includes a tulip whose petals contain a smaller tulip, a wink at the craft itself that no one needed to see, like initials sewn inside a coat. If you stand long enough, you can imagine the clatter of wooden poles when the scaffolds came down, the long exhale of the workforce like a wain finding its way through reed beds. Engineers, whose bedtime stories involve load distribution, have solved how these domes carry themselves. Rings of compression, layers leaning on one another the way elders lean in a photo taken after a long lunch. There is nothing scandalous in it. There is only patience behaving like stone. In the treasury, the ledgers yawn and close. A column labeled balanced earns its little flourish, a proud tail on the final digit. A page of corrections shows the rhythm of humility. Wrong number, right number, a line, an initial. The peacock throne remains more famous in recollection than metal. Its feathers are now adjectives. The mountain of light still answers to its name and still lives under a glass that is cleaned by someone who thinks about fingerprints for a living. The capital that lost its water still hosts evenings where wind plays with latticework, and the lizard on the locked step still has no interest in keys. The women's notes remain the quietest piece of executive power on record. If you added the words, "Please rotate canopies," to the margin of any modern agenda, half the room would look up and say thank you. We could pretend all these mysteries were solved in a burst, like fireworks folded into research papers. The truth is sweeter and much less noisy. They were solved by people who enjoy the word, probably, who like lining up pinpricks along a paper edge and saying, "This must have been sewn," who find joy in realizing that the scribe who wrote Thursday but later had to sharpen his reed, and therefore set the decree aside, which is why the ink shade changes after the third line. There is something stunning in knowing that an empire is just a community of people tolerating one another's habits, negotiating with weather, fixing drains, revising lists, and writing down what melon tasted like on a fortunate morning. If you're still awake, you may let your eyes follow one last detail: a water map like lattice, a ledger number with its proud tail, a tulip hiding a tulip, a note about lamp wicks braided with 3 threads. All of them are small. All of them are sufficient. They carry us without insisting. They solve a little and leave a little unsolved, which is the correct ratio for sleep. And if you've drifted, the pages can keep turning on their own. The way fans sometimes continue to tick after the switch is off, or the way river air continues to enter a room long after someone has closed the shutters because it remembers. The shape of the opening. You might not expect a treasury to be quiet, but the quiet is where most of Mughal India's secrets learn to breathe. It is a soft quiet, the sort that gathers in the folds of a silk ledger when the clerk lays his palm there to keep the page from turning itself. If you're still awake by the time I find the note about coriander, feel free to subscribe, or simply think kindly toward the idea and let it float off like a lantern on a slow canal. Tonight the Empire will whisper in little specifics: a chip on a royal seal no one repaired, a tulip in stone hiding a smaller tulip, a garden's watercourse remembered by dust. These are the sorts of facts that never hurry. They stroll, they stop to look at geometry, they remember where the sun falls at 4. If you follow them, they will take you through 4 rooms that used to be rooms and are now situations. The hidden court where letters look like errands, the marble where builders left pencil lines under the flowers, the counting rooms where jewels become arithmetic, and the gardens where the catalogues of death turn out to be very gentle reading. At dawn, the palace archive unlocks itself by habit. You can tell a scribe opened the shutters a finger width because the dust on the sill makes a neat stray rectangle where he set the latch. The emperor's orders come first, as if power should be alphabetized. The envelopes are tied with cotton thread, not ribbon. The empire trusted knots more than bows and stamped with a seal that, after the monsoon of a certain year, shows a tiny nick near the lower right. It is the calendar's thumbprint. When you see the nick, you know the order was issued after a wet afternoon, when the seal slid off a polished stone tray and met the floor with the quiet thud of a small fruit. Someone proposed recutting it. Someone else wrote later in the margin. The later never arrived. So the broken corner travels forward through time, a minor herald of decisions. Orders from the emperor himself aren't always the most imperial. A few lines begin in a broad, confident hand and finish in a tidier one, as if a tired king lifted his wrist and a nimble secretary parked the sentence neatly. One decree about transit taxes is interrupted by a smudge shaped like a fingernail. The clerk had ink on the side of his finger from studying his read. It's not a scandal. It's a human attending to a long morning. The instructions read like a grocery list with consequences. Reduce the levy on salt by a fraction. Confirm the width of boat planks at the new ferry. Send a copy to the northern office because the older copy wandered during rains. Every empire looks fierce from far away. Up close, it is piles of paper asking one another to be reasonable. Beyond the throne hall, behind carved screens and a habit of understatement, the women wrote with the patience of people who knew how domestic items reshape politics without raising their voices. A princess kept a notebook whose first page records the correct sequence for steeping saffron water, first not milk. Yes, it matters, and whose second page notices that the price of coriander suddenly dipped on the same. Day of visiting envoy sent baskets of early limes. Gossip disguised as inventory slips between lines like a fish sliding under lily pads. There is a letter that rotates canopies every third Friday, so they fade evenly on the windward side. It sounds fussy until you realize those canopies shaded the legal petitions courtyard, where equal shade meant equal patience. Another note asks that the scribe put the inkstand on the emperor's left. The wrist has been sore. The sentence is almost a family sigh, but also logistics. The sort of intimate information that lubricates rule. A young niece writes a poem to a cousin about the way light enters the women's rooms at noon and draws latticed honeycombs across the floor. She tucks it sotto voce beneath a list of cloth colors for an exchange of gifts. It is executive power camouflaged as household grace. Men at the chancery drew bold lines across maps. The women moved people with the weight of a 3-word reminder. Lampwicks braided, and the lamp burned just right at a negotiation. The letters close with a long, careful breath. Marble takes over the sentence. At the Taj Mahal, after dusk, the white stone decides to be a memory of water. Guides like to whisper to prove the acoustics. The building answers with a soft version of itself, as if it were embarrassed to be famous. Under the curling inlay vines, there are construction scratches thin as eyelashes, the geometry that guided the chisel. You can see them where conservator lifted a loosened leaf and peered beneath. They are the pencil marks of a miracle. The calligraphy grows taller at the top, so the script looks even from below. The trick requires no conspiracy, only affection for the eyes of strangers. In the inner echo chamber, a single syllable returns as a polite replica. Not quite you, not quite not you, the way your reflection looks in polished silver. Laser surveys found tiny sockets where scaffold poles once nested, and faint leveling lines at ankle height that allowed the floor to be flat and pretend it had always been inevitable. It is strangely restful to know the sublime was installed with. Measuring strings and plumb bobs that swung like sleepy pendulums, the whole place is essentially a well-organized whisper. A short ride away, the stone at Fatefur Sikri retains the memory of thirst. If you kneel, you can feel crystallized salt roughen the surface, a map of where water used to misbehave. Channels told themselves stories across courtyards, but a few told them in the wrong direction. A reservoir sat too shallow under a rash sun. A drain forgot which way was downhill for a few indulgent yards. Long before poets announced the city's dramatic death from drought, the paperwork had been staging a smaller, more accurate play. Inspectors wrote tidy notes. The fourth cistern fills quickly but empties slowly. The north conduit accumulates silt like a bureaucrat accumulates reasons. The well by the elephant court smells honest. The one by the mint smells of metal. They tried fixes, and then they tried moving. A door was left locked with its key inside. A guard in the evening tapped each door with his stick out of habit, including the one that never opened again. The city became a lesson only because lessons are tidy. In truth, it is an archive of almost nearly sufficient shade, nearly deep enough channels, nearly the right decision to stay. If you listen very late, the stone gives a chalky little sigh, which might be chemistry and might be the imagination hydrating itself before bed. Back in Agra, the peacock throne continues not to exist in one piece and therefore thrives. When treasure is whole, it demands attention. When it is less, it asks only to be read. The throne's afterlife is mainly receipts. A treasurer copies columns in which seat with birds becomes weights, then becomes adjustment following removal, then becomes 3 separate payments to 3 different workshops for mounts, joints, and the agreeable fiction called misc. Paintings done later, safely after the disaster, insist on peacocks poised like etiquette instructors. But the workaday evidence says the idea of a peacock was portable even when the metal was not. The style's tail feathers show up in lacquer on a box in a remote palace. The curve of the scroll escapes into a sword hilt. The attitude remains when the actual feathers have fled like alumni who keep telling the same college story. If you ask the records whether anyone mourned, they will offer figures that balance as a form of consolation. Balanced is a lovely word to find at the bottom of a column. It wears a flourish like a quiet smile. The famous mountain of light is most talkative under magnification. Tiny scratches suggest it slept beside an older setting and learned its habits from friction. Early descriptions are composed in that generous genre called probable. A courtier reports a bright stone with the air of one reporting the weather. Another insists the same stone belonged to a cousin's cousin and proves it by describing a banquet. Later, the cutting changed its conversation with light, and the stone agreed to sparkle in a more modern dialect. People longed for a single pedigree that would behave like a genealogy tree, branches reaching backward to a seed you could name. The diamond offered instead a hedge, adjacent twigs, some graphs, a thriving confusion. This turns out to be the more humane shape for a famous object. It lets the world fall asleep without deciding whether it has solved anything. It is content to be admired at noon and misunderstood at midnight, like everyone else who's ever held a glass to the window and wondered which ray of sun came first. The ledgers for the dead look stern at first glance and then soften like sugar and tea. Court physicians recorded emperors' final weeks with a vocabulary designed to never wake a patient. Fever is called warmth. A rasp is called dryness. Fatigue is called a desire for the quiet room. Recipes run along the margins in small letters that keep the page company. Barley water cooled by passing air through a damp cloth. Pomegranate broth strained twice. Rose sherbet thinned to the color of dawn. Between the doses, you find logistics that sound like kindness disguised as procedure. The bed is moved nearer the window, but not into the draft. Incense is timed to follow the wind. Visitors are limited by the calendar rather than by virtue, as if the sky had decided whom to admit. When death arrives, the note says it has visited. It does not take possession. It simply calls and is received. The bath water is warmed, the towel is warmed, the cloth is placed with a fold just so. The prayers are the ones that love repetition. A messenger rides out to a cousin who, because last week's note mentioned a longer nap, has already begun to pack. There is grief, but it is filed in the right drawer. The paper knows where to put it. The paper also remembers gardens, which is appropriate because gardens are what paper looks like when it learns to flow. Bobber kept a traveler's affection for running water, not speechifying rivers, just orderly streams that accept instruction. He wrote of terraces where water paused like a guest between rooms, of square shadows for tea, of the way a channel could persuade noon heat to behave like early morning. Later generations miscopied some measurements or pretended to for convenience, and the water expressed its displeasure by vanishing downward, which is water's equivalent of sending a polite letter of resignation. Modern eyes from space, which never tire and never ask for pomegranate broth, see faint rectangles under fields and lanes, the palimpsest of paradise. If you stand at the edge of a present street at the hour when the old channels once caroled, a breeze sometimes pushes dust away from a ghost bed of water, and you can smell, well, not flowers, nothing heroic, just the faint tin scent of a bucket that remembers being useful. The best map is the one your feet can read. The dust pauses where a pool used to shine. The shade gathers in right angles without knowing why. Without asking permission, the past lends you its geometry, and your afternoon becomes more symmetrical than it needs to be. Somewhere between marble and garden, the archive returns with small kindnesses. A docket slips from a bundle labeled Assorted Matters of No Plot. It explains that melon at breakfast was especially pleasing because the river breeze arrived early, and that the steward is asked to place the inkstand on the left to save a wrist from complaint. Another paper notes that a parrot has started pronouncing the name of the old capital with a nostalgia inconvenient to the new one. It is suggested the bird be instructed in updated loyalties. A recipe for pickled limes goes missing and the kitchen says nothing, which in kitchens is a form of triumph. A clerk, perhaps the same one with the inky fingernail, writes to say a boat plank standard should be a finger's breadth thicker, so that accidents will prefer other occupations, which is as close as paperwork comes to humor. You won't find these sentences on monuments, but they make the monuments possible. They are the screws, no tourist photographs, the low step concealed for elders with a view, the extra cup placed on the tray because someone might arrive unannounced and still deserve tea. Even the Taj Mahal, which patented the idea of looking inevitable, contains winks for the patient. On one stair, the mason lowered a riser by the depth of a thin coin, where he knew older courtiers would pause, giving their knees a secret. In a corner blossom of red stone, a single petal points half a degree off the others, the artisan's signature pretending to be wind. The domes carry themselves by rings of compression that lean into one another like relatives in an after-lunch photograph. Engineers have diagrams to prove it. Poets have the same idea and call it family. The peacock revenge colors live on in lacquered boxes. The throne itself survives as attitude. The mountain of light trains daylight to behave. The Tephra keeps its locked door. The women behind screens keep their detailed authority. The empire appears to be solved and keeps secret the best solution of all, that most mysteries shrink to human scale under a lamp. If you're still with me, you can picture one last detail and let it carry you. A thread cuts a groove into sealing wax after years of tying the same bundle. A ledger's final digit has a confident tail and then a tired dot. A garden path turns by a square of shade because water asked it to. A physician cools barley water by holding it in a north window and watching for the steam to stop fussing. None of this demands a conclusion. It asks for a long blink. You can drift now while the clerks quietly check their columns again, and a watchman on his rounds taps a closed door he knows will not open, because tapping it is the tradition, and tradition is just a good habit that has learned to drowse standing up. You might not expect a smear of ink, no wider than a fingernail, to have anything important to say about an empire, and yet that is where tonight begins. In a quiet room, lined with wooden chests and latches that prefer to stick, a clerk unknots a ribbon that has been obedient for 3 generations. The knot remembers more decrees than any of us, and loosens with the grace of an old friend. If you're still awake by the time we reach the footnotes about coriander and lampwicks, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I'll never know, and the archives certainly won't. We will move slowly through 4 soft chambers of Mughal India, where secrets were usually practical, geometry behaved like lullaby, jewels learned to vanish politely, and gardens kept maps long after people forgot to ask for them. Nothing urgent will happen. People will date their letters carefully, rulers will whisper to paper, marble will speak in echoes that end before they begin. And you can drift whenever you like as the pages keep turning by themselves. The archive opens just at the color of milk tea. Doors breathe, shelves exhale a little powder, and the day's first broom takes the old dust for a walk. Someone crystallized power here into paper and string, and it has been humming like a beehive ever since, at exactly the volume of a librarian's cough. Orders come bundled by topic weights and measures. River crossings, saffron markets, the thickness of boat planks that keep changing their minds, and each slip lays its head against the next, as if they were children napping in a row. The emperor's hand is bold in the opening flourish, then more human by the second line, and half the time a secretary finishes the thought with a tidy tail on the last consonant. You can trace the seasons by the ink. Winter strokes are viscous and reluctant. Summer lines brighten as if warmed in the sun between words. Margins are the best historians. In one decree, the clerk writes that the new seal should be warmed before stamping because it sulked yesterday, and the impression below, faint at 2 corners, confirms the diagnosis. In another, a subordinate inserts a side remark about the North Road being not a road but an argument with stones, and a patient senior hand answers, as roads are, the empire is most itself in these tiny disagreements, the sort anyone could solve with a midday nap and a better pair of sandals. Not every signature agrees with itself. On a tax remission, the swash on the emperor's name hums early and stalls late, then resumes as if someone else lifted the pen for a breath. It has the smell of delegation, that ordinary miracle of large governments, and nobody seems afraid of it except the chronicle writers, who prefer their sovereigns unassisted even in grammar. A scribe with meat habits has dated his notes by later day, and also by the phase of his beard, short, medium, long, not recommended in wind, and nobody told him not to. A vellum wrapper contains fragments that used to belong to something impressive, now reduced to practical immortality. Half a sentence about bridge timbers, a list of spices capped by a doodled fish with a crown, a note reminding someone of someone else's tendency to sit in a draft. You begin to see how modestly the extraordinary behaves when nobody is visiting. The orders about troop movement share a cabinet with instructions for counting loaves, and the loaves have better handwriting. The clerk who binds them adds a knot you can undo with one pull, a gift to the next person, the way a stranger might leave the door latched but not locked. Behind the carved screens further in, letters breathe in a different key. The women write in ink that seems to understand velvet. Their pages fold history into domestic grammars, gentle recipes for collective life. A princess catalogues the pattern of sunlight across the floor of the women. Escort at each hour how at dawn it copies the lattice on the east wall, and by noon it forgets geometry and behaves like spilled milk, and in the next breath she notes that the price of coriander fell suspiciously on the same day an envoy sent a basket of limes. Not a coincidence, she writes, and underlines at once, like a patient teacher. Another file records the rotation of canopies in a courtyard every 12 days, so that the cloth fades evenly, and no petitioner should feel he waited in an inferior shade. A third asks that the emperor's inkstand be placed on his left this month, because the right wrist has been fanciful. A diagnosis physicians would have taken a paragraph to reach. You can watch negotiations between rival factions sneak in disguised as sewing schedules, and the fate of a provincial governorship arrive folded inside a letter about saffron threads. The handwriting is delicate but not afraid. A niece writes a poem about the way the fountains make conversation with the jackdaws. It is attached to a note on fabric deliveries and nowhere formally acknowledged, which is the best kind of acknowledgement. Power is never louder than a good list. Night falls and marble wakes. The Taj Mahal speaks in geometry that doesn't mind being admired. Builders' codes are carved into its sleep, tidy pencil lines still hiding beneath the glossy inlay, like undergarments that never expected company. A conservator lifts a curling petal of jasper and finds the original guideline no thicker than a hair. A sentence fragment of measurement, a sibilant as long as the sun. The calligraphy around the arch grows taller as it climbs, so that it appears exactly even from the ground. Your eyes are treated with courtesy, an expensive courtesy disguised as inevitability. Stand at the proper spot and whisper once. The building whispers back a version of you that seems to be listening more carefully. The echo dies before it becomes gossip. Tool marks trail off where a chisel's side, bored with magnificence for a second. Laser surveys patient beams with no sense of poetry have found anchor holes where scaffolding once nested. Tiny sockets in the white sea, and faint lines across the floor that might have been level markers or cautious celebrations of levelness. It is soothing to know that the sublime took notes, measured twice, and wiped the dust with the back of a hand. A little way off, Ftefer Sikri keeps the memory of thirst the way a book keeps the smell of rain. Scratch the stone with your nail and Salt listens back. Channels cut in confidence cross courtyards and then, unforgivably, hesitate. One conduit loses its nerve at a shallow stair and pulls exactly where it shouldn't, as if the water got distracted by the view and forgot its job. Reports pile up in calm lines. The second cistern fills in half an hour and empties in 4. The eastern drain silts, the northwest well is honest. The mint's well tastes of iron. You can feel how hard everyone tried to fix it, which is somehow more restful than success. In later stories, the city is abandoned dramatically for lack of water. In the paperwork, it lingers affectionately, like a family that keeps visiting a house it has already sold. A door was locked and the key placed on a hook inside, so a guard taps it each night with his stick to honor a tradition he doesn't intend to change. San remembers where fountains used to be. Children play in the square geometry of former basins without knowing they have a plan under their feet. Cities are good at keeping quiet about almosts. Treasuries think in numbers even when jewels are involved. The peacock throne becomes arithmetic as soon as a pen looks at it. Its afterlife is a long, polite avalanche of columns. Seat with birds becomes gold by weight gems, unspecified mounts to be reworked. Then adjustment for loss, then 3 payments to workshops for repairing what cannot be repaired and documenting what cannot be admitted. A later painter, safe in an era that loves the idea of peacocks, paints peacocks that look like professors. The earlier ledgers care more about the angle of the backrest and the price of solder. The throne leaves its body behind and travels as posture. You find tail feather scrolls and lacquer at a hill palace, and a curving stem that once supported a jeweled bird now flourishing humbly on a sword hilt. It is almost considerate the way objects become style when they cannot remain themselves. The treasurer at the bottom of a page writes balanced, and you feel him straighten in his chair like a man who has tidied the horizon. The diamond that later acquired a mountain's name has stories like cats multiplying in the dark and rearranging themselves when you turn on the light. Under magnification, early scratches confess that it slept long in a different setting, rubbing its shoulder against a ridge it eventually forgot. Stylists of the day described it as if describing weather or the temperament of a distinguished horse. A courtier writes of a bright stone at the emperor's breast and adds, as an afterthought, that dinner was excellent. Another memoir remembers the same stone but relocates it to a cousin more deserving. Memory is the only jewel that improves when polished. Then one day, cutters renovate the stone, and the diamond begins speaking modern light, shorter sentences, more sparkle for less mass, as if trained on a new instrument. People argue pedigrees, as if a stone were a person with grandparents and a report card. The fragments suggest a less family-minded truth. It is a hedge, not a tree, a thriving tangle of plausible branches. If you ask the archive to resolve it, the archive pours you tea. That is its way of saying, perhaps. The accounts of death are so orderly that they hardly look like endings. A physician describes an emperor as final week with the crispness of a weather report. Warmth increased on the 5th day. The appetite preferred broth. Sleep requested the north window. Conversations were brief and polite as drizzle. Remedies line the margins like little benches under a tree barley water, strained twice and cooled by passing air through a damp cloth. Pomegranate reduction at the color of dawn. Rose sherbet thinned until the spoon forgets where it is. Diet logs reveal that the mighty wrestled with the same small negotiations as the rest of us. More mint on hot afternoons, fewer almonds after sunset, no pickled mango while the cough behaves like a drummer. You can hear the physicians speaking to one another in the syntax of care. We shall warm the towel. We shall warm the second towel. It is decent to warm towels when one is finished. When the visit finally arrives, the note says exactly that. The visit occurred. A short series of verbs closes the page: washed, wrapped, rested, and the next sheet resumes with the price of come-in and a request for stronger twine. Grief, too, is filed and therefore bearable. Gardens never stop filing. Babur wrote them like love letters to water. He loved it best when water behaved like an obedient traveler, stopping at squares, turning corners politely, pausing at terraces as if it had been taught manners by shade. Later, maps miscopied, channels wandered away, and water resigned, as all competent officials eventually do. But the ground remembers. High above, the stern eye of a satellite draws rectangles inside fields, and lanes faint traces of channels that once told stories, dusty parentheses where pools used to sleep. If you stand just so in the late afternoon, you'll feel a square of coolness that has no reason except history. The wind seems to walk where water used to. City planners quietly borrow these phantom lines as if thanking the past without making a speech. A street takes a left because a vanished stream once preferred that. A park stretches to exactly the size of a forgotten basin and then stops, like a child who has counted to the correct number and refuses to count higher. The Empire's favorite shaped square turning into square still decorates the breeze. Elsewhere in the papers, the small humanities continue. A steward argues that melon at breakfast be sliced thicker on festival days for the sake of optimism. A chamberlain notes the emperor's preference for sandalwood smoke, but only after the 5th hour, when it speaks softly. Someone proposes an official afternoon reserved for napping after petitions, which seems like good government achieved at minimal cost. A princess lists the color of rugs by month and adds, almost shyly, that the crimson survives monsoon better if encouraged with compliments. Another letter mentions that a parrot in the women's court has taken to repeating the name of an old capital with unnerving nostalgia and asks if anyone might teach it a newer tune. A wise reply suggests feeding it pomegranate seeds while reciting the current city. The fruit will do the persuading. In the corner of a ledger, a doodle of a tulip puts on a crown and then, perhaps embarrassed, tries to hide behind arithmetic. The Empire obviously functioned because of these quiet jokes performed near the business of serious lines. Back at the Taj, the circles of pressure in the dome lean into one another like cousins at a wedding photograph after lunch. Engineers can draw the forces as tidy arrows. You can feel them as a confidence that has decided to be gentle. A mason long ago lowered one stair by the thickness of a thin coin for old knees. Nobody wrote it down because kindness isn't usually a document. Micro grooves along the marble's edge keep candlesoot from settling, a domestic invention hidden under poetry. In a red stone leaf at knee height, one petal points slightly away from its sisters as a signature. The artisan's way of saying, I was here, but quietly. Even the fences that keep tourists from getting too affectionate with the inlay have been aligned to allow the echo its favorite seat. The building is globally famous and locally considerate, which is a rare combination in bricks. Vitefer Sikri, even in its silhouette, rehearses a comedy of patience. The elephant platform stands like a punctuation mark in a document nobody is currently reading. Salt freckles the paving. A watchman in the long-ago night used to tap each door and pillar with his stick in a sequence learned from an older watchman. It wasn't security so much as choreography. Once he tapped the locked door with the key on its hook inside one of those architectural jokes that keeps being funny for centuries. If you visit at noon, you will wonder why anyone stayed. Visit at dusk and understand they stayed for evenings like that, when bats write cursive above the square. Cities rarely fail for dramatic reasons. They simply drift a few inches from where they meant to be, and waking up seems like too much work. Among the jewels that learn to travel is rumor, the old Mountain of Light has the best passport. Its early setting appears in inventories that contradict one another with old world courtesy. One day it is a girdle ornament, the next a turban jewel, the next an eye of a deity who, one suspects, had several. A scuff along one facet tells a small, incontrovertible truth of prolonged acquaintance with a harder neighbor, perhaps a secure clasp, perhaps another stone with opinions. Later cutting turns its brilliance outward rather than inward. It had once glowed like a coal, then it chooses to glitter like a chandelier. People imagine this is a moral narrative, progress or loss, when it is merely different modes of light. The archive approves of difference. It keeps both versions and never decides. like a wise aunt who refuses to take sides between cousins because both have brought cake. In the physician's papers, the details of endings become gentler the longer you read. A Saturday is good for broth. A north window is good for thinking. The bed should be moved, but never so far that it forgets the door. Incense should follow wind and not precede it, like advice offered only when asked. The handwriting shrinks in proportion to the voice getting quieter. Each measure is small on purpose, so nobody has to jump. Where modern charts would spike and dip like mountains, these lines stroll. You can hear a young student doctor writing down a recipe twice because he enjoys the word barley and adding a clarification. The barley should not be indignant, which probably made sense to him and still does. After the final entry, space remains on the page, left blank with good manners. The next day begins with a list of lemons. The gardens complete the sentence. A channel meets a channel at a right angle and becomes a courtyard that thinks. A square pond waits in the middle for the sky to introduce itself. When there is no water, the outline continues to be persuasive. The city grows around these ghosted instructions because it is easier to obey architecture than to argue with it. Modern planners insist they are following cost curves and traffic models. In truth, they are reading with their feet. If you walk a certain line at dusk, you will arrive at a corner that smells a little colder, as if stone remembered the wetness of a fountain there, and you will think you chose it. Baber's favorite gardens ran with the river's manners, not its muscle. He liked water to be a citizen, not a tyrant. The satellite photographs, peering like sleepless owls, show his diagrams faintly on the present, as if the city keeps its old homework tucked under the mattress. If you're still awake, the knot from the first paragraph awaits your fingers again. You could untie it in one pull. You could leave it for the next set of hands. A clerk with an ink-sneezed thumb prints a small crescent on the corner of a receipt and does not bother to blot it. A mason's coin-thin kindness remains underfoot. A jewel practices both coal glow and chandelier spark in memory. A physician warms a towel and then warms the next towel just to be thorough. A garden holds its breath where water once paused, as if listening for a dignitary who is late but certain to arrive someday. The empire never finishes speaking. It mumbles in inventories and hums in marble and leans into its domes like a family. Nothing needs solving this late. You can drowse while the treasurer writes balanced one last time, and the archive, being courteous, turns down the lamp without taking credit. You might not expect a palace archive to yawn, but the one I'm thinking of does, right on schedule. With a kind of polite creak, a wooden jaw gives after 4 centuries of patient listening. The room has the color of weak tea and the smell of linen that once had opinions about sunshine. A clerk unfastens a cotton tie from a packet of decrees, and the knot loosens like a veteran who knows the drill. If you're still awake by the time we begin arguing with a footnote about cinnamon, feel free to subscribe, or don't. The paper is not keeping score, and I'm certainly not taking attendance. Tonight we will idle through Mughal India by way of its least dramatic corridors. Secret letters that were never exactly secret. Stone that communicates better than most diplomats. Jewels that learn to travel as stories after their carriages broke. And gardens so fond of right angles that even the wind walks carefully across them. Nothing urgent will happen. The pens will be refilled, the marble will hum, and the ledgers will end as they always do with a small sum and an even smaller. Sight out the first drawer opens with the dignified complaint of old brass, and out comes a decree bearing the emperor's name, flourishing at the beginning like a trained hawk, and landing at the end like a pigeon that has remembered it is domestic. The line thickens where the hand paused to think about rice prices, then where the mind wandered to carpets. The emperor wrote many orders himself and allowed many more to be written for him, which is how a great power can wear slippers without anyone noticing. The margins entertain themselves. Against a command about bridge repairs, a secretary scribbles, No, the river intends to be inconvenient again after monsoon, and draws a rectangle that looks suspiciously like a boat that would prefer to be a house. Below a taxation schedule, another hand adds, keep the inkstand warm in winter. It sulks when cold, and we can see the sulk confirmed in a pale seal impression as lopsided as a sleepy cat. It is hard to fear an empire whose paperwork includes tenderness for office supplies. A few orders have mismatched signatures, the familiar monogram beginning like thunder and ending like drizzle. In one case, a final flourish appears to have been supplied by a confident clerk who practiced imperial endings after hours and finally tried one on when no one was looking. The result is oddly persuasive, like a borrowed robe that fits better than expected. Another packet contains the opposite, an entire decree in a second-tier hand with the emperor's name added later in heroic ink, as if history were a document that had to be countersigned by its protagonist. A pin pierces the top corner iron turned the color of tea, and someone wrote, "Do not lose," in a voice that knew perfectly well how often such instructions are ignored. On the back of a fiscal memo, a tiny map explains where the best shade falls in the palace garden at each hour in June. The scribe marked noon with a dot that looks like a seed, and I choose to believe he planted one thought there each day and watered it with gossip dot behind the marble lattice. The letters from the women's quarters travel quietly, accompanied by the sound a silk scarf makes when it changes its mind. The handwriting is neat as etiquette and twice as observant. A princess keeps a list of who can be trusted with news of engagements and who can only be trusted with recipes. The latter column is longer and, frankly, more cheerful. She compares suitors to fabrics. One is like cotton embroidered with gold, comfortable but ambitious. Another, like velvet in a warm season, beautiful and inconvenient. An older aunt records the price of coriander, the character of a new tutor, and the lamentable tendency of a small grain parrot to repeat the old capital's name during evening prayer. It should be bribed with pomegranate to learn a more current tune, she advises, displaying the domestic skill of solving metaphysics with fruit. Schedules for bathing, schedules for reading, schedules for the rearrangement of cushions. Politics lives in these pages like a cat hiding behind curtains, visible whenever the curtain moves. Elsewhere, a roll of thin paper holds 2 lines you might miss. The emperor prefers his pen this month slightly freshly cut. The wrist is capricious. Imagine a physician of the hand diagnosing ink angles. Another sheet reads, "The canopy over petitioners is to be adjusted so shadows fall equally, which is fairness enforced as geometry." There is a memorandum on scent. Sandalwood smoke after the 5th hour is preferred. Before that it speaks too loudly. Notes for a performance include the instruction that the opening drum should sound like a jar being closed, which suggests a musical. Philosophy based on kitchen confidence. In a ledger of dowry linens, a scribe has doodled a garden with tiny square pools. In a moment of spirited candor, he has added 2 dots for geese and then crossed them out, as if ashamed to imagine animals in a book for numbers. These are the whispers that keep the imperial day in a straight line. When the sun slides out of the courtyard, the stones take over. The Taj Mahal becomes a soft conversation between distance and detail. You can stand under the main arch and watch a quiet trick that artisans arrange long before you. The calligraphy grows taller as it climbs, a generosity that allows your eye to keep pretending that everything is level. A mason left a hairline guide on a petal of inlay, a nearly invisible scratch that refuses to confess it is useful, and another signed his. Presence by turning one leaf a degree or 2 away from its siblings. The building wants to be perfect and generous at the same time, and so it remains slightly invisibly considerate. Engineers who are fond of beeps have scanned the marble and found anchor holes for scaffolds. Ghost sockets from a time when the monument were wooden bones. Sound behaves there like a responsible guest. If you whisper a single syllable directly under the dome, it comes back to you wrapped in an extra layer of politeness, as if it has stopped to remove its shoes dot at Fatefur Sikri. The architecture remembers thirst as if it were correspondence never answered. The red stone is freckled with salt, a map of old disappointment. Channels stride across the courtyards with military purpose and then falter near a step, as if confused by the etiquette of descending. Reports piled up in their day, wonderfully calm. The second cistern fills like a rumor and drains like a sermon. Wind arranges dust into walls in the courtyard of the elephant. The mince well is iron in the mouth. Coins prefer it. Later stories say the city was abandoned for a dramatic drought. The paperwork says maintenance budgets soaked, caravans rerouted, and a dozen small calculations were more persuasive than a large announcement. A guard used to tap the doors with his stick in a pattern inherited from his predecessor. One door was forever locked with its key deliberately hung on a nail inside, and each night he tapped the outside for the benefit of a tradition that understood its own joke. A city does not collapse so much as it naps in its clothes and never fully wakes. Treasury records have the comfort of arithmetic. There is always a place where the page ends and the day forgives itself. When the peacock throne unseated itself from Delhi and began a career as a rumor, the ledgers did not panic. They subdivided. What had been thrown with birds and gems became weights of gold converted to monthly salaries, then to repairs for fort gates, then to carpet purchases of a surprising optimism. The birds reappear in lacquer designs a decade later, curiously learned birds who have taken vows of abstraction. A list of payments to artisans includes the entry for the remounting of items that wish to be remounted, which is unusually philosophical for an accountant. Toward the bottom of a long page, a clerk has written "balanced" in a neat hand that looks pleased with itself. And you may imagine him straightening, imagining his spine as a column from a better palace dot, as for the famous diamond. Its early life reads like the itinerary of a very confident comet. Inventories disagree with gentle conviction. In one it is a breast ornament, and another it sparkles on a turban like a small private sunrise. And in a third it resides in a deity's eye, which is either literal or an excellent metaphor for the way devotion notices anything that shines. Under magnification, the stone admits prior arrangements. Tiny abrasions tell of the setting that once hugged a facet and then did not. Later cutters persuaded the crystal to flash differently, coaxing it into a modern conversation with light. People call this improved or ruined according to temperament. The diamond, of course, does not care. It practices both old glow and new sparkle as circumstances require. Provenance claims multiply like cousins at a wedding dinner, and every cousin remembers the meal differently. The archive smiles, sets a saucer on a cup, and says, "Everyone is a little right after a long afternoon." Medical notebooks carry their own hush. Physicians wrote in a tone that never hurried, even when everyone else did. An emperor's final weeks appear as weather reports for a single household. Slight warmth in the afternoon, breeze requested at the north window, soup successful, mango discouraged. The remedies have the rhythm of lullabies. Barley water is to be boiled until the bubbles are small and respectful. It is then to be cooled by passing air through a damp cloth, because the body listens better to kindness. Rose sherbet should be diluted until the spoon forgets it is heavy. There's a whole page. Devoted to towels, one to be warmed, a second to be warmed after the first, and a third kept unreasonably warm in case the first two prove forgetful. The handwriting grows smaller each day, the way voices do when they begin to prefer gesture. The entry for the last morning relies on verbs: washed, anointed, wrapped, rested. The next page resumes with the price of come-in, which is exactly how grief shares premises with life without making a scene. The gardens continue the conversation in right angles. Babur liked water best when it remembered mathematics. He asked it to proceed from square to square like a pilgrim reciting a favorite verse. Later generations misplaced some channels, ignored others, widened a few, and narrowed a few more. The city folded over the old geometry like an absent-minded quilt. Yet when satellites peer down with their owlish patience, you can see pale traces of those original complements to the river straight lines that meant coolness here. Shade there, an invitation to idleness in 4 equal corners. At ground level, you can still feel a temperature that changes by a degree where a basin used to sit. A lane takes an unnecessary left because a vanished rail told it to centuries ago. A municipal plan describes the route in terms of cost and traffic. The wind and the stones understand it as courtesy to a long-forgotten pool. Even the modern park sprinklers, programmed by someone who likes spreadsheets, incidentally rehearse square dances at dawn. The paperwork around gardens can be unexpectedly dramatic about small plants. An overseer compares the manners of cypresses and finds that one particular row has a tendency to opinion. A poem submitted with an omelet. Irrigation budget. Governments were always generous with genres. Claims that fountains speak 3 dialects, murmur for mornings. Debate for afternoons. Advice for evenings. The engineer assigned to check the cistern levels writes an apology for using a stick not long enough to reach the truth, and promises to procure a more philosophical stick. In a letter about cleaning the channels, a steward worries that gardeners are wearing their sandals to the wrong degree of looseness and therefore scuffing the edges, a danger to both symmetry and knees. The emperor asks that the square pole be swept of leaves after 4 because the reflection of the sky is most handsome at 5, and no one wants to see leaves admiring themselves in the meantime. It is bureaucracy as choreography, and very soothing once you commit to the steps. Back in the apartments behind the screen, the correspondence continues to fold power into domesticity like sugar into milk. There are instructions for placing petitioners, their shadows do not quarrel. A mistress of the wardrobe writes about dialogues with the seriousness of a treaty. The indigo is loyal, the saffron unstable unless praised, and a certain crimson heroic to a bow. Fault. One sheet carries a list of morning readings, each line ending in a brief mood: astronomy, conciliatory; history, skeptical but polite; poetry, responsibly excessive. Another page announces that the ink is to be guarded from drafts because it catches colds and misbehaves. A child's handwriting, irregular and brave, asks whether comets prefer almonds or pistachios. An ant replies in a different ink: comets are impartial. Offer what does not crumble. The emperor's secret letters, when they are truly secret, are most often practical. Inspect weights at Lahore, one says, as if you were not yourself. This is excellent advice for any inspection and also for any afternoon nap. Another instructs that a revenue officer be applauded for doing the work without making speeches about the work, which is, I think, the origin of all effective civilizations. A third warns that the price of pepper has become theatrical and should be encouraged to study modesty. Somewhere a clerk underlines this twice and draws a small peppercorn wearing a turban. The human impulse to draw on official papers has never been fully contained by empires or laminations. Stones, meanwhile, keep telling us safely uncontroversial truths. A tiny tool mark beneath a lotus petal says that an artisan changed chisels mid-stroke and never apologized. Plaster bears the faint line of a snapped string that once defined a perfect right angle. When the string broke, it left a powdered constellation, proof that even the firmness of geometry begins with something as perishable as thread. A step along the north walk is lower by the thickness of a coin, a concession to knees remembered by no decree. Even the fences installed to shepherd modern visitors have been aligned so the beloved old echoes can sit where they prefer. The building is globally famous enough to appear on postcards and locally precise enough to keep its shoes neatly by the door. By the time we return to treasury pages, the arithmetic has become almost drowsy. The peacock throne disperses into invoices for carpenters, receipts for solder, and notes about jewel mounts that wish to be retaught their duties. A single line records a courier's payment for carrying news of the throne's condition to a distant ally. Below, a scribe has jotted, "He walks swiftly," which is the sort of small faith one human enjoys extending to another. The diamond's file becomes a family argument conducted in legible hands. A careful sketch shows one facet polished flatter in a later year. In the margin, someone has written, "Still the same jewel," like a reassuring uncle. History is full of these stunning murmurings from people who never expected their pen scratches to become evidence. The last pages of the doctor's notebooks become almost whisper-proof. They advise that the sick room be perfumed after the hour when perfume behaves, and that worry be instructed to wait outside with the footwear. Water is to be counted by sips, not gulps, because sips are more conversational. The night following the visit, the dignified euphemism that ends so many royal diaries, has a note in a measured hand. Window left open. Stars polite. The ledger after that is about salaries and rope. Even grief, it seems, lives in a city that must keep buying string. If you're still with me, the knot from the first packet sits quietly on the table, looking as though being untied would be a kindness you could easily perform tomorrow instead. The letters have no plot beyond what they do to your breath. The marble understands you without making a point of it. The jewels would rather be stories if it means they can travel lighter. The gardens walk at right angles toward evening, and when the water doesn't come, the air will do. Somewhere a clerk warms the second towel because the first seemed uncertain. A princess tells the parrot the correct city while feeding it pomegranate so that persuasion and nutrition coincide. An engineer buys a longer stick to reach the truth at the bottom of a cistern, and a watchman taps a locked door because the tapping is the point. Paper loosens its jaw again, the archive drowses, and the lamp lowers itself with a sigh that has been rehearsed since the day a pen first decided to be important in this room. You can close your eyes whenever you like. The sums will still balance, the echoes will find you, and the pepper will consider humility in the morning. You might not expect a misplaced thumbprint on a royal decree to change the temperature of a room, but in the Mughal archives it sometimes does. A draft slides under a door, the paper lifts at the corner, and everyone present remembers, very politely, that empires are run by people who occasionally have ink on their fingers. If you find yourself still awake by the time we get to the part about the accountant who weighed a pearl on a coin scale and wrote close enough in the margin, you're welcome to subscribe. But don't hurry. The paper isn't going anywhere, and neither are we. Tonight is a meander through Mughal India's least restless corridor's secret, letters that whisper through perforated stone screens, geometry that behaves like etiquette, jewels that travel by rumor, especially when guarded, and gardens that keep their promises in straight lines. Nothing dramatic will happen. The lamp will grow thoughtful. A clerk will cough into his sleeve with bureaucratic delicacy. We will drift, and the pages will drift with us. The first packet is tied with a cotton ribbon that has become eloquent about knots. Inside lie orders bearing the emperor's name, some that he wrote himself, some written for him, many that were adjusted by assistants who knew his wrist almost as well as his mind. In one, the opening flourish looks like a falcon just before it remembers it is attached to a glove. At the end, the line thins, as if the pen became shy about the price of timber. On the back, a clerk has drawn a tiny rectangle labeled "Shade at 3 in the afternoon," which says more about power than most speeches. Another decree carries two signatures that almost, but not quite, agree with each other. A later note explains in small, apologetic script that His Majesty favored a shorter tale that day. The state, it seems, once shifted by the length of a pen's curl. There's an order about road repairs that pauses, mid-sentence, to wonder whether carts prefer square nails or round. The question is never resolved, but a doodled wheel rolls calmly along the margin. Each spoke a brief experiment in optimism. One handsome decree is all business until the final line, where the ink darkens as if the author leaned closer and adds, "Return the pen with its cap," suggesting the palace owned at least one temperamental inkstand capable of a scene. Plenty of authority survives here, but it travels in slippers and keeps track of small kindnesses. A scribe notes that petitions should be considered first by those facing the sun, since the others enjoy shade already. Another proposes that the morning hour for audiences be defined not by clocks, but by the moment pigeons abandon the roof for the courtyard, a standard as reliable as most calendars and much friendlier to birds. Beyond the lattice, letters move silently between the women's quarters and the offices where men pretend their quills or oars. The handwriting is patient and very exact, like embroidery that happens to be sentences. A princess advises her cousin that certain suitors are best evaluated in hot weather, since bravery loses its polish when one is uncomfortable, while others should be invited to examine carpets barefoot to discover whether their compliments survive contact with wool. An aunt writes in a tone of unassailable experience that coriander, politics, and youthful enthusiasm should all be stored in cool places. She recommends a shaded shelf and a near window, respectively, and suggests that youthful enthusiasm will do what it pleases. A small note recommends scented smoke after the 5th hour, when sandalwood has learned civility, a detail that convinces you incense has a curriculum.1 folded sheet contains nothing but a list of cushion arrangements and the moods they encourage. 2 at the back, composure. 1 under the elbow, firmness. Place triangularly on a carpet, reconciliation. Place face down nap. Another carries a map of the garden with suggested corridors for gossip. Careful loops that pass both the pomegranate tree and a trustworthy chaperone. A woman's signature ends with a tiny, emphatically square dot, the punctuation of someone who has watched many decisions take the scenic route. The paper itself smells faintly of cardamom, as if the letter had spent a patient afternoon near a tray of sweets. These documents do not overturn dynasties. They keep dynasties from tripping over their hems. Even the secrets are quietly practical. Inspect the waits at Lahore as a stranger. One emperor writes to a trusted official, and if they greet you as an old friend, revisit them as an older stranger. Another letter praises a tax officer for doing the work without explaining how he did the work, which is the purest compliment a bureaucracy can give itself. A third instructs that musicians opening a ceremony strike the first drum like the closing of a jar, so the audience's breath can sit down. On the same page, a different hand adds, jar lids must fit, which reveals either a commitment to metaphor or touching concern for. Containers dot when the sun softens and the walls begin to radiate yesterday, the stone takes its turn to speak. At the Taj Mahal, the letters become geometry, and geometry behaves like manners. The lines of Quranic calligraphy grow taller as they climb, the way deference grows when it reaches for a throne. From below, it all appears evenly proportioned because the builders wanted your eyes to feel welcome. Under a leaf of inlay jasper pretending to be petal, carnelian pretending to be Donna Mason left a guide scratch no bigger than a thread. It has hung on through centuries of careful cleaning, a whisper from someone who thought ahead without any interest in being thanked. Sound there has its own etiquette. A syllable given to the central space returns wearing a soft coat. Clap at the wrong angle and it sulks, which is the building's way of reminding you applause is not a tool. Behind the elegance lurk practical holes. The stone remembers where the scaffolds bit it, little squares that once held wood and labor and muttering. In some corners, the marble glows with slow affection for the dawn. Stand anywhere long enough, and you will discover the right place to stand. A visiting ambassador in a document we should not take too seriously complains that the building is too symmetrical to be entirely awake. He is wrong, but understandably so. Symmetry is what very alert buildings do when they are being kind. Fatever. Sikri speaks another dialect, red stone with a gifted memory for water. Channels stride across courtyards with confidence and then hesitate at the brink of steps. Like officials unfamiliar with casual footwear, alcoves keep coolness the way jars keep grain. The salt that later freckled the walls looks like the handwriting of a patient sea that never learned to spell. We are told the city emptied because water failed. The paperwork proposes an accumulation of smaller embarrassments. Revenues took the long way round. The well that should have been deep turned out merely persuasive. A delivery of pipe stoppers discovered a new and unsettling appreciation for geography. A guard's log records, without apparent emotion, that a door kept locked for ceremonial reasons was tapped each night to confirm its loyalty. The key hung inside, where it could serve as an example. The city didn't die. It politely excused itself and then stayed away. Treasury books keep their nerve through everything. When the peacock throne became a traveler, the ledgers did not fake. They measured. Gold by weight became stipends by month. Gems became maintenance budgets for fort hinges. The story of a seat turned into the comfort of payroll. A line item appears for the remounting of ornaments that wish to be remounted, which quietly admits that some objects have preferences. There are receipts for lacquer boxes painted with birds, suspiciously similar to the ones that once perched on the throne's canopy, as if iconography were an inheritance tax paid in pictures. Near the bottom of a long page, a clerk writes, balanced, with a flourish that rewards his own patience. You can almost hear his shoulders square. The diamond with a future that would later require passports wanders through earlier ledgers under names that enjoy arguing with each other. In one inventory, it is a breast ornament stubborn as a planet. In another, it resides in a crown with the attitude of a sunrise. In a third, perhaps briefly, it lives as the eye of a deity, which is either blasphemous or a very tidy metaphor for a belief system that knows brilliance when it sees it. Under magnification, the crystal admits previous arrangements. Scratches small as rain on still water show where an early setting pinned it differently. A later cutting coaxed it into a new conversation with light. Opinions were filed just as firmly as settings. Too modern, writes a conservative appraiser. Just modern enough, says someone who decorates sentences with optimism. The stone itself, inconveniently for critics, sparkles regardless. Somewhere between jewels and grain, the palace doctors kept notebooks that are practically bedtime stories. They list pulse and appetite and the exact thumbful of spice added to a broth. The emperor's breath is recorded as steady but prefers the window, which is a diagnosis many people would accept today. Towels are to be warmed, then warmed again, and then warmed just in case. Medicines are instructed to behave inside honey until they learn patience. A cup of barley water should be cooled by the passing of a breeze through damp cloth. The breeze is not specified because breezes tend to apply without needing appointments. When the inevitable occurs, the account grows gentler. Washed, anointed, wrapped, the next page returns to common prices. Grief has always lived beside lists that gardens inherit that practical tenderness and translate it into rectangles. Baber liked water best when it remembered to be direct. He drew it into squares that negotiated altitude with short, courteous steps. Later kings kept and lost and rediscovered his geometry in the way families keep and lose recipes. Even now, from the sky's unblinking point of view, you can see pale lines where channels once condensed sunlight to behave. On the ground, a sudden coolness appears where a vanished basin used to settle the air. as if shadow itself were remembering it had an appointment. City planners explain these alignments with utility, which is not wrong. But the wind noses also manners. A gardener files a report that the cypresses in the north aisle have formed opinions, meaning they lean. He suggests tying their ideas to stakes. A poem attached to an irrigation budget, because bureaucracies enjoy plots in both senses, proposes that fountains speak 3 dialects: morning murmur, afternoon debate, evening advice. The engineer responsible for cistern measurements apologizes, politely for using a measuring stick that cannot quite reach the truth, and requests funding for a more philosophical stick. A steward complains that sandals scuff the edges of pools when ties are incorrectly loosened, and asks whether the court shoemakers might hold a seminar. There is also a memo about sweeping leaves from the square water at 4, because reflection looks its best at 5 and should not be asked to share the stage with foliage. Back where correspondence lives, life resumes with that intimate, restful precision that only large households manage. A list schedules the hour when the curtain in the women's library should be lowered to allow breezes but not gossip. Instructions for perfume declare that the scent of rose should approach like an apology and depart like a memory. A child's hand writes quickly to ask if comets prefer almonds or pistachios. In a different ink, an aunt replies, "Comets are impartial and messy. Give them what drops least," a seamstress recommends. That sleeves for certain officials be cut shorter to discourage gesturing while accounting. She adds, their wrists will learn humility. The sums will too. The emperor's truly private notes, when you catch them, are not confessions so much as reminders. Take time with the first page. He advises himself on a day of judgments, so the last page does not hurry. Another murmurs, do not walk faster than news travels, a policy that would simplify modern traffic. A third commands, very simply, listen at sunset, which is either spiritual discipline or an appreciation for birds that clock out on time. None of these instructions will unseat arrival. All of them will lengthen a life by about the width of a breath dot. By now the day is leaning. Lanterns add their own mellow geometry to the edges of the paper. A clerk somewhere is lighting up the seals so their impressions will look well on the shelf tomorrow. He has learned which wax behaves in damp weather and which sulks in heat. He keeps the reliable cake wrapped in fabric that smells faintly of cloves and prudent decisions. In the treasury room, a chest is closed with a sound like a bass note politely played. The guard writes in his log that he tapped the door whose key hangs inside, and that the door offered no objection. Far off, in the red city that liked water on scheduled terms, evening steps down its stairs of light. If you have reached this sentence with your eyes half closed, the archives would approve. They were written in that posture by people who understood volume control. The vanished orders will keep misplacing their signatures. The princesses will continue to file opinions no louder than silk. The marble will remain considerate to strangers who need help feeling small. The throne will travel very slowly through the accounting books until it turns into salaries and lacquer birds. The diamond will glitter on and off the page depending on who is telling the story that day. And the gardens will hold up their square mirrors to the sky until the sky blinks. Somewhere a physician is warming a second towel because the first towel looked uncertain. Somewhere a gardener is tying an opinionated cypress to a stake. Somewhere a steward is teaching sandals to mind their edges. And somewhere a messenger practicing invisibility is weighing justice by pretending not to recognize any weights at all. The room exhales. The ribbon remembers its knot. The lamp lowers itself as if it understands budgets, and everything important continues quietly, even when you're asleep. You might not expect a smudge of lampblack on a royal seal to change the way historians breathe, but here we are, holding a thin sheet of paper in very polite silence. The paper smells faintly of gum arabic and the kind of tea that has forgotten its own temperature. A corner is turned down, not by drama, but by humidity doing its slow choreography. If you're still awake by the time I start describing the tiny thread used to sew two torn decrees back together yellow, possibly silk, very slightly overconfident, feel free to subscribe. Or don't, I'll never know, and the paper will be patient with both of us. This is Mughal India after midnight, where power whispers through lattice screens, geometry carries itself like etiquette, jewels keep diaries they never intend to publish, and gardens practice the square root of tranquility. There will be no plot. Instead, there will be handwriting that looks like calm wind on water, and doors that are tapped once a night simply to be sure they still agree with the idea of being doors. Archives begin their yawn before dawn. A low table accepts parcels tied in cotton that has learned the personality of knots. Here is an emperor's order nominally his, realistically stewarded by the wrist of a scribe who knew the curvature of command. The first line approaches the margin like a courtier approaching a throne, obliquely, respectfully, but without forgetting its shoes. A second decree, same date, contains the same instructions with a slightly shorter final flourish, as if the pen paused to consider the cost of paper. On the back, a clerk has penciled a reminder, return the seal warming pan, which implies not only a seal and a pan, but a pan with feelings. Another bundle reveals decrees that technically vanished long ago, reappearing now from within book bindings where they served as efficient, anonymous stiffeners. The margins bear domestic weather reports. The peacock cried early, and ink reluctant. It is comforting to learn that authority also waits for ink to decide who it wants to be that day. There are signatures that practice calligraphic optimism. And there are the more humble witness marks, a thumb, a nail impression, a triangle pressed with the corner of a ring. One emperor's order ends with an instruction to carry out a rote survey by the method of equal paces, which is beautifully vague and absolutely typical. A note tucked beneath that sentence adds, avoid paces taken after lunch, which is beautifully specific and possibly more useful. Another document concerns the price of timber and the angle of shade cast by new rest houses. It suggests measuring comfort in cubits of cool air. Power, we realize, kept devices for counting that included lengths of breeze and the attention span of travelers. Behind the purdah, those intricately carved screens that make privacy look decorative letters move like careful music. The voices are precise and dry, the paper dignified, the ink in a mood to remember. A princess advises her cousin that prospective alliances should be observed while the men watch wrestling. The faces are honest then, she writes, and they do not know it. Another letter explains that a polite argument about saffron quality can disguise a negotiation about dowry furniture. The writer recommends using a wooden spoon as a prop because it confers moral authority. In a diary note, an older aunt declares that decision-making improves when chairs are not too soft. She suggests a cushion folded once and never twice, which, if you think about it, is as robust a political philosophy as any. Someone carefully lists which perfumes behave well in hot weather vetiver. Sandalwood, if tamed, rose when it has learned to be modest, and which should be saved for monsoon evenings, when the air holds conversations like a patient host. Another sheet is a seating map for a small concert. Dots indicate musicians, tiny rectangles, trays. Small circles, known gossips. 2 stars mark where breezes usually stroll in without knocking. A postscript notes that the lattice on the west side permits listening without being seen, if one leans like a gracious. Question: the handwriting is uncompromisingly neat. These are not secrets designed to topple dynasties, only to keep them from stepping on their hems. The women's registers speak of loans given in bangles rather than coin, of safflower dye that expresses opinions on everyone's fingers, of a gardener paid in shade at noon. It all adds up to an empire that functions because 1,000 tiny adjustments hold it steady, like a carpet woven from promises not to hurry. When the sun sidesteps into afternoon, stone takes the stage with its particular manners. The Taj Mahal's inlay, the Petra dura that convinces agate to become leaf and carnelian to dream it, is a petal reeds as ornament, but the stone also keeps working notes. Under a perfect curve of white is a hairline chisel tick, a survival of construction day conversation. Lasers, which are nothing if not polite whites with strict opinions, have mapped the scaffolding holes that once held the building steady. Now they look like punctuation for a sentence that went very well. The calligraphy that climbs the gateways grows larger as it rises, so the words appear even from a respectful distance. It is the architectural equivalent of speaking clearly without raising one's voice. If you clap under the main dome, a thing guides ask you not to do, and yet sound performs one slow cartwheel and then sits down to rest. Acoustics here honor the same etiquette as audiences. The marble at night has its own color grammar. Limestone joints cool into thin silver, while the inlay goes to sleep extremely slowly, the way a storyteller closes a book but keeps a finger at the page. On one terrace, a mason left a barely visible compass scratch. It is a dot smaller than the punctuation at the end of this sentence, and it has accomplished its task for centuries without additional praise. Around the complex, garden paths align like thoughts that have learned to agree. The water channels offer their absolute horizontals to a sky that arrives with its own straight lines. Imagine a worker standing in ankle-deep mud, sighting down a cord that believes in Euclid more than in the weather. Imagine the cordial stubbornness required to tell a river that it will move in rectangles. The Taj's geometry is like good handwriting. You don't notice it until you start trying to imitate it further west. The Teffer Sikri holds the curriculum vitae of a city that was brilliant at being a capital right up until it needed water in June. The red sandstone courts are mathematical in their patience. The pillars disagree with each other only in elegant ways. In the archives, logistics memos from that period read like apologies folded into paragraphs. Someone reports that a convoy of leather waterbacks burst upon becoming philosophical about burden. Another complains that lime plaster does not care for sudden decisions. Salt blooms under a wall are described as the handwriting of a disappointing sea, which would be poetic if it were not so practical. The city's great audience hall once amplified whispers. It now amplifies boots and low-voiced admiration. Across 5 brittle pages, the plan for a deeper well is edited, rewritten, and finally deferred until the weather learns restraint. Weather, as always, declines the invitation. The inventory of treasure keeps ambling along, even as cities rearrange themselves. The Peacock Throne, famous for becoming a traveler, spends an unexpectedly long time as columns of numbers. A ledger entry labels it seat with birds, precise weight unknown due to poetry. The clerk, probably smiling into his sleeve, distributes its value into salaries, hinge repairs, lacquer, and the replacement of silk cords that resign under heavy tassels. Another line item lists 2 umbrellas with conscience, which may sound grand until you realize the umbrellas shade clerks and petitions alike. In a collection register, miniature paintings begin to multiply that depict peacocks with increasingly self-aware tail feathers. Iconography becomes a sort of accounting interest. When the throne is finally gone, the books do not mourn. They apportion. The empire turns drama into payroll. Then there is the diamond whose name arrived late and never entirely settled. Early mentions are allergic to certainty. One memorandum notes a large clear stone presently behaving well. Another calls it the eye of fortune with the skeptical dot used by accountants who fear adjectives. A gem cutter's notebook, stained with a colorless something that could be boredom, documents a change of facet plan, the pavilion to be moderated, the crown given a tactful confidence. Under magnification, hairline scratches mark where it once belonged to a different setting, which means the stone has previous addresses like any ambitious resident. Opinions trail it the way dust trails caravans. Too conspicuous, say the cautious. Inadequate for the canopy of a god, say the pious. Quite perfect in strong daylight, says someone standing near a strong window. The stone naturally remains indifferent. It reflects whoever is looking, just as faithfully as water does. For companionship with jewels and building stones, there is the written bedside manner of palace physicians. Their notebooks, bound in quiet browns, keep track of pulses using a vocabulary of rivers, strong like the Ravi at monsoon, hesitant like the Yamuna near winter, opinionated like the bees when it sees gravel. They advise warming towels twice just to teach heat good habits. Barley water should be strained through cloth scented by shade. Saffron is to be used when conversation grows slow. Nutmeg, when conversation grows faster than its grammar. In one case, a cough is said to dislike carpets with complicated borders, a very specific diagnosis, possibly confirmed by sneezes in the margins. The emperor's sleeplessness is treated by reading passages from a history book with a reliable rhythm, which feels extremely relevant to our current project. Times of final illness are recorded with a courtesy that leaves space on the page. Washed, anointed, swaddled in linen as if memory could be taught to hold, reads a line as thin as a feather's edge. The next entry attends to payroll for boatmen who must ferry mourners and grain at the same time, which is how life usually organizes itself. An autopsy of a lesser courtier, when permitted, concludes that diet should avoid mangoes taken in a competitive spirit. Another physician argues gently with fate about the dignity of old age. He prescribes quiet, which he defines precisely as the hour, after the lamps are trimmed, but before the night watch checks the gates. When he draws a chart of symptoms, the graph has the shape of a garden path. Speaking of gardens, Babur planted his ideas as if they were geometry drawn in green ink. He liked water that admitted to being water, and he liked it to tell the truth in straight lines. In the later centuries, those lines grew fainter and stronger as rulers and rivers negotiated who owned whose patience. If you fly over the northern plains today, the faint ghosts of his channels still arrange the air. Shadows pause there as if consulting an old calendar. On the ground, you can stand where a tank once shouldered the sun aside. The air cools for a small radius, as though memory continues to refrigerate it. Survey maps from the 19th century draw this persistence in gentle blue, the cartographic equivalent of a lullaby. Satellite imagery in our own fidgety age continues the work in more insistent colors, proving that stillness can be measured with tools that never sleep. The gardener's accounts are some of the most persuasive literature of the empire. One inventory lists 14 cypresses with opinions, meaning they lean. Stakes are requested to teach the trees better arguments. Another report suggests that fountains speak 3 dialects, morning, afternoon, evening, and that the noon fountain, if asked to discuss philosophy, prefers to answer with shade. There is a dispute about lotus placement resolved in favor of the fish, whose schedule apparently demands uninterrupted surface area at dawn. Tiles along a pool are removed on the theory that they give sandals dangerous ideas about slipping. Someone orders gravel, coarser, so that thoughts slow down when walking. The engineers measure water in cubits and in size. Both are treated as legitimate units. Back in the women's wing, a small ledger tabulates the value of gossip as if it were a spice. The going rate for a whispered hint about a provincial governor is 2 lengths of silk ribbon. For the health of a powerful aunt, only 1 length, because aunts typically announce that kind of information themselves. A princess records the precise number of steps from her writing cushion to the good light in the late afternoon 38, unless the carpet has been reprimanded. She also keeps a running list of words that appear in flattering praise poems and should therefore be avoided in conversation. Moonlike, doe-eyed, gem-strewn, and the ever-suspicious serene, which often precedes requests for money. When she writes about the weather, she assigns it a posture regal when the wind comes from the north, argumentative when from the west. She closes one entry with a recommendation to store letters in fabric that smells faintly of cloves. This keeps both memories and insects respectful. Clerks at the chancery prefer neatness that looks effortless. Wax seals are warmed over coals of a particular persuasion. The reliable brick of wax is wrapped in cloth that has acquired a departmental rank. A memorandum insists that the bell for audience should never be louder than the bell for kitchen duties, because both kinds of hunger require attention. Files are tied with ribbon in a shade described as obedient red. Each evening, an assistant taps the locked door with the key that lives on a hook within. If the door resists, carpenters are summoned, and if the door agrees, a box is ticked with perfect serenity. The schedule calls this ritual affirmation of solidity. It is oddly reassuring to know that the Empire checked daily whether it was, in fact, still a building. Elsewhere, a surveyor reports that a road curves in sympathy with the mango trees and requests approval for a deviation that will please carts and fruit equally. We learn that accountants sometimes used a small set of standard pebbles to keep numbers company. The smooth stone called 11 went missing for a month, and then returned without explanations. In an inventory of gifts from merchants, we find a Persian cat that is almost mathematics, which surely means linear and self-explanatory. There's a complaint about ink that dries faster than honesty. The solution involves adding a measured drop of gum and a sentence about patience. A letter from a provincial judge makes the modest observation that justice, like yogurt, improves when left alone, but sours when neglected. The palace delicately files this remark under both law and kitchen. If you listen closely to these papers and stones and pools, you can hear the empire rehearsing its civility. Orders that remember to ask about shade. Princesses who plot the path of breezes with the precision of navigators. Masons who leave behind guides scratches the size of a pencil point and trust strangers centuries later to find them, nod, and put the dust back. Jewelers who adjust a facet and make no speech at all. Gardeners who plant symmetry not for power, but for the simple pleasure of watching water walk a straight line. Doctors who worn towels for emperors and boatmen without the slightest change of handwriting. It is all very boring in the way a lullaby is boring, which is to say comforting. Night collects itself. The arches fold their shadows like shawls. A scribe stands a page, so the ink in one stubborn letter gives up and stays. A half circle of courtiers leans at the exact degree of attention they have practiced for years. The air draws a straight line through a lattice and comes away smelling faintly of neem. Somewhere a diamond waits in its cloth, while opinions hover nearby like moths at a veranda lamp. Somewhere a throne has become several line items, and therefore immortal. Somewhere the map of a garden is being traced by moonlight without anyone's help. If you have drifted already, the documents will hold your place. If you remain awake, the archives will lend you their patience. The final decree for the day says only this: proceed at the pace of cool water. Then the seal presses down, the wax remembers, the paper sighs, and the room continues breathing very softly, as if the next sentence could last all night. You might not expect a slip of paper with a crooked seal to make the moon feel official, but that is the sort of administrative poetry empires produce when nobody is trying to be poetic. In the archive rooms where the air has learned to speak in whispers, a clerk unwinds a cotton ribbon and lifts the lid on orders that were supposed to have vanished. They did not so much disappear as practice discretion, which is a very different hobby. The paper is the color of quiet bread. The ink has faded into the shade of dried plums. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe just a calm gesture, the paperwork of supporting further yawns, or let the thought drift away like a moth that decided the lamp was too much commitment. Either is fine. We are going to loiter among Mughal India's mysteries, not the dramatic kind, but the one solved by sunlight, patience, and a ruler that always knows where to put. Itself thought someone once warmed the emperor's seal beside a charcoal pan and pressed it onto damp wax with the confidence of a person whose job description includes the word inevitability. The round impression looks perfect until you tilt it and see a small smear, the comment tale of a decision made while a kettle sang in another room. The decree itself is conscientious about roads. It commands a survey by equal paces, which implies a standardized stride that presumably refused to be taller after lunch. In the margin, a clerk has penciled a reminder to return the still-warming pan, a domestic note peeking through the grand procession of imperial verbs. Another order from the same week revises the grain tax by a fraction that could be explained over tea without moving any furniture. Between the lines, a faint secondary hand adds, "Ink reluctant this morning. Paper patient. History sometimes survives because paper has excellent manners." 2. Pages later, the emperor's handwriting returns, unmistakable for the steady confidence of someone accustomed to shaping the world with steady confidence. Yet one decree from an especially busy spring is not his. The script slants differently, the flourishes tidy where his are full. The instructions concern the movement of stone, timber, and paid silence. Scholars solved this puzzle only recently by comparing the invisible stutter in one looping letter. It belonged to a trusted scribe authorized to sign when the emperor's right hand was reluctant, perhaps injured, perhaps busy blessing a garden. The solution is thrilling in the mildest way. Power delegated not by proclamation but by calligraphy's muscle memory. You can feel an empire rotating, almost imperceptibly. On the hinge of a pen-nib dot beyond the formal orders are letters threaded with domestic string. Voices from behind the screen of Purda that makes privacy into geometry. The princesses write with patience and precision, and an interest in the reliable behavior of breezes. A young woman advises her cousin to observe prospective in-laws during afternoon wrestling. They show their true temper when cheering for the wrong man. She notes, a piece of social physics disguised as gossip. Another letter arranges a marriage by discussing dye. The debate over safflower versus madder becomes code for dowry quantities, travel distances, and the character of a distant aunt. The letter concludes with instructions about the proper quietness of slippers on marble, because some decisions should arrive like confident shadows. Tucked in the bundle is a small sketch of the women's court, the lattice screens, marked with minute circles labeled listening, places, and 2 squares for cushions annotated, supportive and rash. It is strategic furniture. Ledger kept by one of the older women reads like Anne. Inventory of microscopic diplomacy. She records who borrowed bracelets and who returned them with more opinions than before. She keeps accounts of cinnamon, pepper, and the rumors they purchased. She writes that the best time to negotiate with a stubborn uncle is after sherbet, before he remembers that he is stubborn. Mysteries here do not explode. They evaporate very slowly until the room relaxes. These documents solve nothing sensational. They merely clarified how a palace ran on the rhythm of women who could count friendship in measures of perfume and shade. The discovery is as undramatic as placing a lamp in the corner that needed one all along. Stone takes over where letters end, and stones, as you know, have a long attention span. Night walks along the Taj Mahal and behaves well. Marble under moonlight becomes whisper-colored. By day we see ornament and praise. By night the geometry hums. Recent scans with careful light have mapped the tiny fossils of construction, the holes that held scaffolds, the hairline circles scratched by compasses before chisels obliged. The absolute horizontals, where water channels once practiced straightness like a polite child at handwriting lessons. Within the grand inscriptions that crown the gateways, the letters quietly increase in size as they rise, correcting perspective so your eye reads humility where mathematics does labor. It is a building that remembers its own drafting table on a terrace. A mason left his reasoning on the stone, two faint intersecting arcs that decide the center of a circle, the way you would find the middle of a friendship by asking it twice. There are iron cramps hidden in marble joints, resting so slowly that a century is merely an interesting afternoon to them. Acoustic tests kindly, non-intrusive show how a single syllable might have bloomed in the dome and then folded itself with a sense of conclusion. Historians solve these not as puzzles but as agreements. The building agrees to reveal, the reader agrees to look politely. The secret is not scandal. It is calibration. Then there's Fete Sikri, a city that rose with confidence and took its water less seriously than water prefers. The red sandstone courts seem carved from a patient sunset. Columns carry lintels and grammatical sentences. Only the reservoirs are shy. Laser surveys of ancient channels, the subtle salts cresting at ankle level, and the laconic complaints of memoranda. Skins burst when sincere about burden, have clarified how a dream capital developed a seasonal sense of humor. It thrived while wells argued with summer, then fell silent when summer refused to compromise. The solution to the mystery is a working equation. Politics plus weather plus arithmetic of distance yields thirst. You may think it obvious. That is exactly what we admire about it. Builders left codes here as well. A set of steps with risers slightly lower on one side, designed for dignified ascent and precise footwear. A hidden groove that drinks rainwater without writing letters about it. A panel of carved screens which, when viewed from the right angle, aligns into a pattern that teaches the eye how to behave in public. The recent mapping of these features produced the same satisfaction you feel when you finally open the stubborn lid of a jar not triumph. Just relief that the jar remains loyal to its profession. We move from stone to glitter, which is only stone with unreasonable opinions. The Peacock Throne is famous for having more biographies than most monarchs. What survives now is not the throne itself, but the paperwork that turned it into a personality. After invasions and relocations and the theater of empire, the throne continues to exist in weight receipts, courier's notes, and illustrations where peacocks rehearse flamboyance with mathematical sincerity. In one register, the throne is listed as seat with birds, precise weight unknown due to poetry, which is an extremely accurate statement. Another entry divides its value into the practical categories of any office: salaries, repairs to a hinge, replacement tassels for the canopy that resigned under the weight of responsibility. Solved. The afterlife of glory is accounting. The jewel inventories are full of glamour behaving itself. Appraisers describe rubies as pleased, emeralds as restful, and pearls as not ambitious, a diamond later rumored to be the famous one we all know by name, appears early under a phrase so careful it is almost shy. Large clear stone currently in a good mood, recent work with microscopic scratches and old gem cutter notes has tracked where that stone traveled, which settings coaxed it to sparkle, and which owners tried to rename it into obedience. The findings are delightfully dull, facets adjusted from optimism to discretion, pavilion moderated, girdle fortified, destiny filed under the letter P for perhaps. It is a detective story that refuses to chase anyone, preferring to walk at the pace of a museum room. With the objects come the people, and the late imperial court knew how to write about bodies without insisting on conclusions. Physicians kept account books of pulses, diets, and the behavior of air. One doctor counted heartbeats with the vocabulary of rivers, brisk as the Ravi after rain, cautious as the Yamuna near fog, undecided like the bees in a chatty mood among stones. Remedies were soothingly sensible, towels warmed twice to keep heat obedient, barley water strained through cloth that had been taught courtesy, powders kept in boxes that knew better than to clatter. A physician's marginal note on sleeplessness prescribes reading a history chapter of balanced length and reliable boredom, which might be the most honest medical sentence of the 17th century. When emperors died, scribes recorded it with a grammar that resisted melodrama. Washed, anointed, bound in linen as one teaches memory to hold, reads a line so thin you suspect the pen tip was holding its breath. The next page calmly tallies wages for boatmen who will row mourners and barley both, because both require a rival. Inquests are rare but precise. One cautions against mangoes eaten competitively, which, while medically disputable, is spiritually persuasive. What modern historians solved here is not a murder but a mood, the empire's refusal to let endings shout. Death is entered as a series of requirements, invoices for candles, notes about which corridor drafts are uncooperative, seriousness calibrated by how many times a bell is rung. Around these rooms, the gardens continue to compose themselves as manners. Babur's early passion for water and right angles left lines that can still be traced by the patient eye and by satellites that draw in the sky with electronic chalk. You can stand on a dusty road and feel the faint coolness where a channel once taught the sun to respect geometry. Engineers write to each other about gradients and the moral character of gravel. A head gardener complains that lotus leaves are encroaching on the dignity of fish. A colleague orders coarser pebbles so that thoughts will slow down when people walk, which may be the point of gardens in the first place. Recent mapping of river shifts in garden remnants has solved a quiet puzzle: why certain neighborhoods feel cooler in narratives than in shade. The answer lies in ghost channels that still guide breezes as gently as a librarian guiding elbows. Old survey maps revealed that pathways now masked by markets used to be water, and the water still keeps the air curious. The revelations change nothing and everything. They let you look at a lane and see a pool with opinions about reflection. They let you stand by a cracked wall and hear the grammar of fountains. We circle back, as archives prefer, to ordinary miracles. A daybook shows the palace schedule of tapping doors each night to ensure their continued participation in architecture. The act is recorded in a column labeled Affirmation of Solidity. One evening, the door does not answer with the expected wooden confidence. Carpenters are summoned, paid, and thanked with leftover pistachios. Another page memorializes a small crisis: the disappearance of the Chancery's favorite seal-warming pan. The pan returns the next morning, attached to a note apologizing for its unsanctioned excursion. Commentators long afterward misread the moment as political symbolism. Recent re-examination of the handwriting solved it more modestly. The pan spent the night in the kitchen because the cook enjoyed printing patterns on sweets. The empire, like most households, was complicated and easily forgiven. Microhistories accumulate. A surveyor proposing that the road should bend toward a mango grove out of sympathy. A clerk complaining that ink dries faster than honesty when the monsoon pretends not to be late. A princess marking 38 steps from her cushion to the best light and insisting that the carpet remain. Cooperative during negotiations. None of these facts will rescue a dynasty, but they rescue the hour before sleep. They show how mysteries can be solved not with trumpets, but with rulers. Not by heroes, but by people who knew where the good shade starts. At the Taj again. The moon lifts its pale shoulder, and the marble re-enters its night vocabulary. Guards with soft sandals trace routes that their grandparents would recognize by sound alone. A mason circle under your hand feels like the moment an answer finishes forming. In a Fatefur courtyard, salt prints continue their delicate calligraphy, writing in the slowest ink ever invented, the sentence that says, Water dislikes being hypothetical. In an old casket wrapped in linen, a diamond sits without agenda, reflecting anyone patient enough to lean over politely. Nearby, an account book yawns itself awake to remind the world that even peacocks have payroll. Final papers of the evening are not dramatic. One tallies ribbon lengths, another lists the acceptable volumes for bells. A third records the restoration of a garden path, 3 loads of gravel, 2 men with rakes, 1 supervisor insisting on the idea of straightness. There is a letter advising a niece that promises should be measured in the width of an ox cart and the time it takes sandalwood to remember it is fragrant. There is a physician's brief note that an emperor's pulse felt like footsteps on a cool corridor, which is both diagnosis and architecture. The mysteries have been solved in the way a closed window solves a breeze. Gently, with no need for applause. If you are awake, you might hear the clerk retying a cotton ribbon over the lid, the sound of a bow that knows its profession. If you are drifting, the archives will keep their own vigil. The candles trim themselves with small sounds that understand their place in the sentence. Outside, a channel that forgot it was a channel continues to convince the air to walk in a straight line. Somewhere a pan resettles on its hook with the modest clink of a veteran. Somewhere a garden arranges its gravel, preparing the nightly lesson in how to walk slowly without being late. And somewhere, deep in the fold of a ledger, the empire writes again the note it always writes at bedtime: proceed at the pace of cool water.